Welcome to Soil Carbon Goddess, a conversation with Kiss the Ground star, Dr. Kris Nichols. I'm your host, Alexis Badenmare, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you to soil scientist and regenerative organic agriculture expert, Dr. Kris Nichols. Thank you so much for sharing with us this hour, Kris.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
So I decided to title our talk Soil Carbon Goddess in homage to Australian soil scientist Dr. Christine Jones. She calls herself the Soil Carbon Goddess, and she gets to wear the crown in Down Under, but you are the Soil Carbon Goddess of North America, Kris Nichols. But of course, as soon as I put that together and we published it online, I was kicking myself because, of course, I realized you would much rather be the glomalin goddess. So let's start there, Dr. Kris Nichols. What is glomalin and why is it so special to you?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the honor of that title. And I think that it's really important for us when we're talking about regenerative organic agriculture and regeneration is we're looking at regenerating the soil. And that's really the fundamental foundation that I think we need to focus on. So when we talk about glomalin or glomalin, it's a biomolecule. It's basically a glycoprotein. It's a sugar protein that is produced by the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. And these fungi are associated with about 85 to 90% of all plants and most of our crop plants. And so these fungi are really important in our agricultural systems because they are a fundamental pipeline to providing nutrients to the plants and allowing those plants to be able to improve and thrive within sometimes some very challenging ecosystems, and what we're seeing right now, especially having to build up that resilience. And glomalin is that biomolecule that the fungi produce to help to protect their fungal hyphae, which acts like as a pipeline in transporting nutrients. But then in the soil, it can also help to protect soil structure by forming a coating on soil aggregates or the pellets that are in the soil. And it's important to have soil aggregates. I think of them as little microbial towns or little microbial homes that exist there. And so you have bacteria and fungi which can grow inside those aggregates and be able to process nutrients and break down minerals, so freeing up those nutrients for them to be transported by the fungal hyphae. And then the aggregates are incredibly important to soil structure and the creation of pore space for good gas exchange, releasing CO2 that can build up around the roots and cause the plants to die. So it allows for the CO2 to escape and the air and oxygen and nitrogen gas to get down to the microbial populations for them to be able to breathe as aerobic organisms, the root to breathe as aerobic organisms, and the nitrogen gas to be fixed by different types of microbes. That porosity is also important to increasing our infiltration rates. So we can absorb more moisture more quickly, and this is important as we look at climate change issues because we don't get gentle rainstorms that last for a day. We get these heavy deluge that comes down, and it doesn't happen as frequently. And so not only do we want to get the water in and as much water in as we possibly can, but we also want to be able to get the water held for as long as possible. And that's the other thing that having this porosity does. So it was a very long answer to something that, again, addresses so much of those fundamental issues that we have when we're trying to regenerate soil.
Well, it's wonderful. It's so interesting to me. This is a totally, and these are things that you participated in discovering at the beginning of your career in the early 2000s. So it's wonderful to have your expertise. So you and I were introduced several years ago by Martha Holdridge, a grass farmer and fellow soil carbon evangelist. She founded Grass Power. And at the time, Dr. Nichols, you were the chief scientist at the Rodale Institute. And there you were managing 15 different research projects on organic agriculture, including the famous farming systems trial, a side-by-side comparison of conventional chemical grain production with organic, biologically based production. So tell us about your years at Rodale and why that research is so important.
Well, yes, I think that one of the things that the years at Rodale was important for was uh, uh, giving me the opportunity to get introduced to people like yourself, as well as to Martha and many of these leaders that exist within the regenerative organic movement, and looking at some of these opportunities that we can have. One of the other things that I credit Rodale for allowing me to do was helping to make a connection. If we want to get a fundamental shift in agriculture, we need to really be connecting farmers with industry. And Rodale offered me some opportunities to be able to get those connections going between industry partners and the producers that are out there, and looking at how we may be able to move all of this forward at an accelerated rate. And it's important for us too to be able to have these research studies, as you mentioned, that are going to be making some comparisons between organic practices and conventional practices. And, Rodale was one of the leaders in setting up that study, the farming farming systems trial in Pennsylvania. It was replicated down in the DC area by a USDA lab, the Farming Systems Project that exists there in Beltsville, Maryland. And it's also been replicated in different areas within the US in similar manners in Wisconsin and in Iowa and out in California. And so we need to have these trials where we are making these types of comparisons, either trials the advantage of these trials is they are on same soil types. The plots are side by side, so you don't have different producers or different management characteristics that go into that, or different soil types that could be impacting those types of trials. So being able to do that and be a part of that, I think was really important. I was also there when the Institute started a similar trial, not just looking at grain cropping as they did in FST, but a similar trial now where they're looking at this in produce cropping as well. So again, having these valuable trials are an important part of what we can do as far as being able to get the research data to have that understanding of what's happening in these types of systems. I now work for the Canadian organic growers here in Canada. So I recently moved to Canada, and here with the Canadian organic growers, that is something that we're trying to work on, or work with producers as well. Maybe not necessarily having the same type of a study design as they have at the Rodale Institute, but definitely working with organic producers and trying to make some comparisons with some geolocated other producers as well.
Very cool. Well, before you were at Rodale, you were working as a soil scientist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. You were with the Agricultural Research Service in North Dakota for 11 years, and you were working with farmers on practices that build soil health. But the work that you did in North Dakota turned out to be really special, and it's been featured in some of the most important books about regenerative agriculture. John Kempf's Quality Agriculture, Gabe Brown's Dirt to Soil, David Montgomery's Growing a Revolution, Kristin Ohlson's The Soil Will Save Us, Judith Schwartz's book, Cows Save the Planet. And so I read all these books and I know your story pretty well, but my favorite My favorite story from this time in your career is a story that Gabe Brown tells. He says in 2003, he was very blessed that Dr. Kris Nichols came to work in Mandan, North Dakota, about 20 miles from his farm. And he says you told him, Gabe, you've come a long way. Your soils have improved significantly, but you will never be truly regenerative until you significantly back off of or even eliminate the use of synthetics on your operation. And I love this story because at this time, you're a very young female PhD, and you're telling an established conventional farmer who's already getting some credit for doing innovative soil health practices that he's not regenerative yet. And he needs to work on eliminating synthetic fertilizers from his operation altogether. That takes incredible moxie. But the other great thing about this story is that instead of taking your advice, the advice of a government scientist, Gabe Brown decides that he's going to prove you right or wrong. So tell us the story. What did Gabe do next after you gave him this advice, and what did he find out?
So yeah, I think it was a really exciting time for me, as you said, just having recently finished up with my doctorate and moving to North Dakota. I'm originally from Minnesota, so moving to North Dakota was being able to come back home. I had done my graduate work on the East Coast in West Virginia and in Maryland, and so I was coming back home to North Dakota, and it was an exciting time for the producers that were there as well. Many of the producers, people have heard about Burleigh County and sort of the Burleigh County producers. And at that time, a group of them had gone to a conference where, to the no-till conference in Kansas, now I can't remember the name, and I should know this. It'll come to me. I apologize. But anyway, they had heard an individual named Ademar Caligari, and he is from South America, and he had been talking about no-till agriculture and these opportunities that you could get and the options that you could put into place. I like to look at the challenges we have in agriculture as options and opportunities. It gives us an opportunity to make some changes, and it provides us with sort of this large suite of options that we can have to be able to put into place. And so he was discussing this. It was a challenging time in North Dakota because these producers, many of them, were still in the paradigm of doing summer fallow, where they would basically take the whole year, a whole year off. So they would grow a crop every other year, and that fallow period would be for that whole year, and they would either be doing a combination of chemical tillage or tillage and chemical application, herbicide application, to make sure you didn't have anything growing. And the idea behind this was to save water, because a plant is going to be sucking water from the soil. And there had been a lot of research that had gone on to basically show that if you grew a crop every other year and you kept the soil completely bare in between time, that you could save more moisture for it to then be able to grow and get a higher yield in that cash crop. And although research had indicated that this was possible, and if you were doing the right type of, they would essentially use tillage to create a mulch layer on the soil surface to try and seal it so that it would stay bare, but they were trying to reduce evaporation, because you're having these very bare soils that are there, um, dark bare soils, and you'd get a lot of evaporation off of the soil with the moisture. But you wanted to again use tillage to sort of seal it off, so that you keep the moisture trapped. And so eh, this is true, and it works, but it's still very limited. One, you're only growing a cash crop every other year, so economically was extremely challenging in that area. And the other thing is that although it could help to keep some of the moisture, what they were finding is it wasn't really doing it well enough, and we weren't managing water well enough. So you were losing more moisture to evaporation than you could manage to store, and that you were losing a lot of, your soil to erosive forces when you're doing this tillage and you're keeping the soil bare and not protecting it with armor or anything like that. Um, so the producers were looking for other types of solutions. There have been some producers that had been doing no-till in the area, in the region for a while, but it hadn't really grown to that point until they went to this conference in Kansas, and then listened to Adam Ayer, and were sort of realizing that, hey, we have some other options. And so this group of producers came back to North Dakota. They invested in some no-till equipment as a soil conservation district. So they were all members of the soil conservation district, and so the soil conservation district purchased some no-till equipment for the producers to share, and they all put in small fields to check this out. So they were a little bit used to, again, doing some sort of on-farm trials themselves, or checking things out where they don't convert their whole entire farm to a particular practice, but are really now taking a small field or a few small fields and seeing what might happen. And so they had been doing this for a little while before I got to North Dakota. And then when I moved to North Dakota in 2003, they had been in no-till practices for a few years and had been working with trying to add diversity to the crop rotation, and doing a number of the regenerative practices, but without the focus on entirely on soil. I think, and this is why I keep going back to regenerating soil and the soil being the foundation, and why I'm very honored that talking about the soil goddess, is that when we're just sort of trying to check the boxes or say I've used this regenerative tool, but we're not really thinking about how that's going to impact the whole entire system and how that's impacting the soil itself, which is where you're getting these nutrient flows, the water flows, all of these things that I spoke about before that are essential to plant health and productivity. And so when I went out to Gabe's ranch and was discussing many things with him, it was a little bit more. He didn't quite introduce this in the same way as Gabe and I. It was a little bit more of a challenge to me, that on what can I do next? How can I actually move this forward? What is it that I can actually, I'm not, I know that I'm not where I want to be, and I know that there's more that I can do, and what is it that I can do next? And so, I had spent at that time well over 10 years of my life with working with mycorrhizal fungi. I started as an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota working with mycorrhizal fungi. I knew the power of mycorrhizal fungi and the microbiome. Not nearly enough of that, but I understood that it existed. And so, that was part of my challenge to him, was that what we would see with mycorrhizal fungi is the impact of these synthetic inputs on the fungi and on their activities. And so that's kind of where it came to just saying, you're not really going to be able to optimize the efficiencies and tap into that power of the soil microbiome as long as you're continuing to have these high input types of systems. And so what he did was, then he was working with reducing those inputs. And again, like I said, it wasn't something that they would go through, and he didn't take his whole farm off of the input train right away. It was, we'll see where it is that I can reduce that. And because he had also integrated livestock on his farm and had been doing that for several years, it provided him with another option to be able to help to manage weeds. It also provided him with another option to be able to manage fertility, where for him it became sort of a thing that he could utilize the animals as the tools for weed management and fertility management, if issues arose with reducing his inputs. And so that became, I think, where he started to go on the path of really being able to reduce those inputs.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story. So after 4 years, he decided he didn't need synthetic fertilizer anymore, which is amazing because it's, you don't have many farms that have that closed loop system where they're not using off-farm fertility. And of course, it has to do with the animals, which we'll get into. I'd like to talk with you about that at length. So I'll save that for a minute because I do want to talk about Kiss the Ground. It's just so amazing. I mean, there were a lot of books written about what you did in North Dakota, but I'm guessing that when you were a young soil scientist working with farmers like Gabe Brown, you probably weren't fantasizing about being the star of a documentary film narrated by Woody Harrelson. So let's get into some of the amazing things that you teach us in Kiss the Ground. One of the best quotes is, "The soil environment can hold more carbon than the atmosphere and plants living on the surface of the soil combined. We have an incredible ability to be able to store that carbon in the soil in a relatively short period of time." So you've talked a bunch so far about the life in the soil, but how does this actually work in terms of taking carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and making that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere end up as carbon in the soil?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point about the soil itself. And when I'm thinking again about regenerating soil is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, organic matter bound to the mineral matrix of sand, silt, and clay. So we didn't start off when planet Earth sort of evolved over time. And as planets are created, you don't start off with soil. You don't have soil until you have that ability to make organic matter, that to create those bonds of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen together. So without photosynthetic activity and in an early planet environment, an early Earth environment, it happened, life started in aquatic environments. And so they started with microorganisms. They started with microscopic photosynthetic bacteria that are similar to today's algae. And then you had a relationship where it's similar to what we see today with lichens, where you had the fungus, the precursor to the mycorrhizal fungi, and the precursor to plants, the synthetic bacteria, that combined their resources in order to be able to provide these benefits. And then as they washed up on shore, and started to build up those populations, the fungi started to break down the minerals in the same way that lichens do today, and started to work with other fungi and bacteria to really start to build up that organic matter. Because when they do this, it's far more efficient. Life grows at a rate at which it has access to water and nutrients. And so, if you can do a process that's far more efficient in being able to get access to those nutrients, that's going to allow you to replicate at a higher rate much more quickly than other organisms. And so they started to build up and dominate, and started to the bacterium started to differentiate cells having different activities, and that sort of evolved to create what we see now as modern day plants. But it was important for this relationship to exist together, for them to be able to work with the environment that they're living in. And so when I think of regenerating the soil, it does go back to the fact that we need to get more carbon in the ground. And I think of us having we have a carbon problem. And I think that sometimes I like to say it's a carbon problem, but it's not the carbon problem that you think it is, because we're thinking, when we say a carbon problem, we think of CO2 in the atmosphere and that being the problem. The carbon problem is that we don't have enough carbon below ground. We don't have enough soil. That's what it is that we've lost. And so how do we go about regenerating that soil? And if we're going to do it, and we're going to do it most efficiently, it is going back to this, how soil originated. How do we get carbon in there and keep carbon there? So what we're really trying to work with is, getting more photosynthetic activity, keeping plants growing as many days of the year as you possibly can. It's not just about the density of the plants at one point in time, but it's that maintenance of keeping plants growing, because otherwise, this is all sort of, again, to what Kristin Jones talks about liquid carbon. This is all about, the liquid carbon flow. And so if we're going to have more plants growing for longer periods of time, that's going to get more carbon flowing below ground and through the roots and through the root exudates, and feeding the mycorrhizal fungi and the other microorganisms that are within that microbiome, feeding having the mycorrhizal fungi feed bacteria. They have phosphate solubilizing bacteria that live on their hyphae that they can feed, doing all of these different types of activities that they're using that carbon for. And then how does this then really go into building up carbon? So we're going to keep carbon flowing, and we're going to flow carbon as many days of the year as we possibly can. I currently live in Canada, so one of the things that I have been challenging producers in Canada to do is to start thinking about the fact that they actually have a 260-day to 280-day growing season. And this is up in Canada, and this is something, as you get into these northern climates, they're like, no, our growing season is too short. And it's not the growing season just of the cash crop that you're growing, but it's the growing season of harvesting sunlight, because that is what we need to do when we're trying to, that is your cash crop. That is your main crop, is how much sunlight can you actually harvest and capture? Because carbon is the building blocks and the energy source for pretty much all life on the planet. And if you tell yourself that I only have, 90 days out of, or less than that, out of the year to harvest sunlight, you're not maximizing that ability to capture sunlight. Pretty much everywhere where we have many of these growing regions is you have 365 days of sunlight. Not everywhere, but pretty much everywhere we do. And so if you're only growing for 90 days or less, that is going to be 275 to 290 days off. And what that means is, when I'm saying that that time off that you're not harvesting sunlight, that whole longevity point of capturing carbon, the number of days of the year that you can do it, we're not then putting the soil through these feast and famine periods. So when I look at the soil health principles that we have these days, one of the things that I've said is, sometimes it's hard for us to understand what those principles mean and how they look at it, and how they look at the system. So what I say is, what we want to do is we want to treat our soil like we're supposed to treat our own bodies. To be healthy, how is it that we're supposed to eat? And so in order to be healthy, we're not supposed to go through a lot of these feast and famine types of periods. And the feast and famine for the soil is, during the growing season, you're growing a lot of plants, and so you give them this huge feast, but then, you have 200 plus days where you're starving the soil. That's not healthy. It's not healthy for the microbiome. It's not healthy for us if we were trying to do that for our own bodies. So, we're supposed to, again, be grazers. We're supposed to have small meals throughout the day, and, continuing to have food. So that's what we want to do for the soil. We want to have that continuous food source for the soil as much as we possibly can. The diversity. We're supposed to eat a diverse diet. That's a big part of the diversity within these agricultural systems. And again, what's really great is, if you're trying to feed the soil for 260 days instead of taking 260 days off of not growing a plant, if you're trying to feed the soil for 260 days, you're also going to have diversity, because you can't have a single crop growing that long. You'll have to have a number of different types of crops that are going to be active and growing. So it adds that diversity. And then, the other thing we're supposed to do for ourselves is, we're supposed to exercise. And, we want to exercise to keep fit, but we don't want to exercise to injury. So for me, exercising is what I had told Gabe about stopping the input, stop coddling your system, stop making the plants not have to work. The plants were essentially at that point in time, they weren't functioning at peak efficiencies because they didn't have to work. They got free food, they got free water because we irrigate. They got, all of their competition was controlled by pesticides. So you didn't they could be lazy. And so, we thought that that was the best thing to do, because if they were lazy, they would put all of their energy into making grain and we would have high yields. But the problem is just like for us, if we're not exercising, we're not healthy, and the plant wasn't healthy. And so even though you may want to say that the plant is getting a higher reproductive rate, the plant wasn't conducting its own metabolism efficiently enough to actually produce at the level that it could produce, nor is it efficient enough to also be making many of the biomolecules that are important to things like the plant's defense responses. Things like antioxidants and polyphenolics that we need to get from our food as animals, the plants produce those as stress biomolecules. Those are things that help to build up the integrity of their cell wall structure. They're things that help them to have defenses against insects. There are things that help, to attract animals to be able to disseminate their seeds. But if they don't have to do those jobs, because we as the growers take care of all of that, they aren't going to be producing those biomolecules. And so then the animals that consume that food to get those biomolecules, we're not getting that from our food anymore. So there's, all of this stuff is so interlinked and interwoven into how the soil functions. So if we do add a little bit of stress to the plant, that's going to push the plant to give off more exudates, work with the soil microbiome to address those issues with fertility and pest management. And that's going to help us, again, the point of this question, and I've gone on a very long story, but the point of this question is to accrue carbon. And so accruing carbon is feeding it to the microbiome putting that carbon into their bodies. So a lot of the things that we're learning about as we look at evolving technology to look at soil, the component of necromass, the dead bodies of all of these microorganisms, is a huge amount of the soil organic matter that we're building up. And when we think about it, I mean, it was basically the necromass of plants and animals that we look at as the biomass of the soil itself, of that organic matter, was the biomass of plants and animals, but it also was those microbes that were there. And so that's a big component of it. In addition, the microbes then making biomolecules like glomalin and other biomolecules to help to protect them and enhance their growth and enhance their productivity and fertility. So it's all sort of interwoven in how we can help with carbon accrual, but it's tied to this fact of having plants growing for a longer period of time and putting more carbon below ground.
Well, we did get a question on Facebook from a farmer who grows corn, and he asked about interseeders and so just to describe to us how this would work. If your cash crop is corn and it has a certain growing period and then you have to harvest it, how is it that farmers are making sure that there are living roots and living plants engaging in photosynthesis for the maximum amount of time over the entire year? What does this look like in practice for, say, somebody whose cash crop is corn?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And, it doesn't just apply to corn, but it applies to a lot of different crops. And again, working up here in Canada, doing some things where we're polycropping or intercropping, where we're growing two plants at the same time, becomes an option that you can have. And when I'm talking about polycropping or intercropping, they actually harvest both of those crops for cash. So they'll be growing two different crops at the same time, and then separating out the seed if need be, running the seeds through a series of sieves to basically separate out the seeds. So they grow things like there's a thing up here in Canada that's called piola, and it's basically canola and peas growing at the same time. And they'll harvest those, and because of the size of the seeds, they can easily separate them with these sieves. So it's essentially that becomes an option that you can have where you're growing two cash crops. The intercropping that or the interseeding that you were talking about, where you have a companion crop essentially, so you have other plants that are growing at the same time as your cash crop. And you can do that. There's different types of technology that are coming into place to be able to do that. One, you could plant both the cash crop and the companion crop or companion crops at the same time, where if you have, like with corn on 30-inch rows, but you use a 15-inch seeder, and in the boxes you alternate, so you'll have the corn seed in one box, and then in the next seed on the 15-inch row, you've got that seed that you're going to interseed, or the seed mix. Many producers use seed mixes in there in that, so you're basically planting them at the same time, but instead of again using a 30-inch plant or 30-inch row planter, you're using a 15-inch row planter. So that becomes one option that you can do with that. The other options with adding seeds during the growing season are, we've got producers that are flying on seeds with airplanes. There are also people who are looking at flying on seeds with drones, various types of robots that are also going out and going between the rows of corn. They've designed some robots that can go through and plant between the rows of corn. The robot will be out there. The other is utilizing some equipment that we've utilized for adding fertilizer in the middle of the season. So utilizing some of these highboys and fertilizer equipment to actually drop seeds between the growing plants that are there. So if you don't have the option of being able to be out there and planting the seeds at the same time, or planting the seeds, you could also go out there with a planter and plant between the rows after the other seeds come up, with a no-till drill or something like that. So you're offset and planting in the middle of the rows. So there's lots of options to be able to do that. And then the final thing is what several people are doing as well, is adding cover crops. So planting a crop after the harvest of the previous crop. And so, what could you do with that cover crop? And I said the final thing, but there's another, I work with a producer in Iowa who's been doing a number of things with what's called relay cropping, where you plant one crop for cash, and then before that crop you harvest, and before it completely matures, you actually plant the other crop. So again, being able to go out there with some of this other seeding equipment, but instead of it being a companion crop that you're planting, it's actually another cash crop. So once you harvest the first cash crop, you actually will have enough time to grow the second cash crop and be able to harvest that. And another thing similar to that is a producer in Indiana who grows soybeans and wheat at the same time. And what he does is, in order to be able to do that, is he's modified the harvest equipment so that when he harvests his wheat, which can be harvested much earlier than the beans, the combine has been modified so that it looks a little bit like a sled that goes over the top of the bean rows and essentially just pushes the beans down, but doesn't harm the leaves. And that allows you to be able to take off the small grain. So you're able to mix a lot of these crops together and provide a lot of these options to extend the growing season. And so for me, these are technological issues. This is not about, again, options and opportunities. This is what I want, is a 260-day growing season. What do I need to do to put into place to get that?
That was a lot of options, a huge buffet of options that farmers can use. I know it's challenging because it's about planning, and it's about acquiring that knowledge of how to do this and seeing it seeing someone else do it and then having the tools that you need. So it's not an easy thing, but like you say, there are a lot of options. I want to take another question here from Facebook because there's a comment here. It says soil microbiomes and new additions to the soil can be an alternate companion crop for carbon fixation. I'm guessing that doesn't ring true to me based on what you're saying, because you say that it is essential to have plants growing in the ground. It's not enough to just compost or put mulch down or have crop residue, or I'm assuming to, just add soil microbiomes. The plants are essential. Is that right?
Yeah, the plants are going to be essential because we need to take that, transform the CO2 that's in our atmosphere. If you're wanting to put carbon below ground, we are trying to take that CO2 out of the atmosphere and transform that. And photosynthetic activity is essential to doing that. We do have, photosynthetic microbes. There are a lot of algae that exist in our soil. And one of the projects that I've been working on is working with cultivating microalgae, and especially in very arid systems, actually applying microalgae to the soil. So adding another carbon source to the system, and adding organisms that are going to do photosynthetic activity beyond the plants. So it's a yes and no answer, because yes, the microbiome does need to have that photosynthetic organisms in order to be able to get that influx of carbon into the soil. Otherwise, you're just basically cycling carbon, but you're not necessarily getting more carbon into the soil without having the plants. You're just moving it around. Now, that cycling of carbon does help to transform the carbon, like I said, into the bodies of the organisms. That's going to be the necromass that's going to be built up, the biomolecules like the glomalin, other biomolecules that are actually helping to create carbon compounds that are going to stay in the soil for a longer period of time, and definitely helping to build that up. But if you don't have that influx of carbon going into the system, and this again goes back to where we were talking about at the beginning with the producers up in North Dakota and Gabe Brown, where they were doing that fallow period, the limitations that had on the productivity of the system and on their buildup of soil, because they took more than 365, it was closer to about 500, more than 500 days where they didn't have something growing in a 2-year period. And that is incredibly detrimental to our ability to be able to regenerate soil. We need to have the carbon coming in, and something photosynthetic that is going to be getting that carbon coming into the system.
I did not know about other photosynthetic, I guess, organisms besides plants. That's really neat. Very cool. Good for that arid area. If you don't have that option of, there was another question here that I think speaks to this, about whether the things that you're saying about, we've been talking so far about people who grow on a very large scale and they're growing row crops, grains primarily. But the question from Facebook here is, well, do these same principles apply if you're doing home gardening? And I'm guessing yes. And it's occurred to me that as I look around my own yard and see a lot of weeds coming into places where I mean to do serious food gardening, that's not a bad thing necessarily. But also thinking about when you close down your garden for the season, or maybe we shouldn't be closing down our garden for the season, it's not just enough to leave a mess of weeds that have become like a thatch on the soil. We should try to have something growing over the winter. Do you have any advice? I mean, I don't know if you're experimenting with this yourself as a home gardener, but what advice can you give us while we've got you here?
Yeah, what's great about the soil is what we need everywhere. And so these principles and the ideas and the concepts of what we can do to regenerate the soil apply across scales, and across ecoregions. Different tools to put into place. So, obviously for the home gardener or smaller types of farm operations, these tools can be put into place. But again, it's a little bit different, the how you're going to put the tools into place. And so again, with small landscapes, it's usually a lot more human labor that's involved in doing this and helping to manage that. But that's, part of this. Again, when I look at liquid carbon flows, to me it's about energy flows. And so how are we putting the energy in? And so part of the energy comes from the human labor and the human capital in putting that energy in there. What we're doing with our human labor and human capital is taking that energy and putting that into the plants so that the plants can take that energy and deliver that to, in the same way that the sun is delivering that energy to the microbiome. And so doing some things, as you mentioned, doing some things where you can in your home garden, doing some intercropping types of things, don't grow just monoculture in one place. This isn't, you don't just have your lettuce patch over here and every year that's your lettuce patch. You want to be adding that diversity to the soil microbiome. So, doing a rotation within your garden on where you're planting different plants. Obviously, like every producer has to do, look at, don't just do a rotation willy-nilly. Think about, pest and disease transfer, think about some nutrient types of things so that when you are making those management decisions. And then, putting on a cover crop. You can do a cover crop on your garden in the same way that a producer can do a cover crop. And it can be some of the same types of plants that you're putting in there. Putting in some things like the rye and some of the small grains like that. Putting in, I wouldn't necessarily do a lot of hairy vetch, but putting in some clovers on your garden landscape. And there's been some people who've made sort of some innovative tools that can act as, if you don't want to do tillage, you can basically use some human labor to create your own roller crimper that is human driven. And essentially, there was a young woman a few years ago who had done this in, she had a greenhouse and she put in a cover crop. And then basically what she did was she took a board, essentially like about a 2x6, and made some holes, put some rope through at the top edge, and then put a little piece of sort of angle iron on the bottom, and then would sort of push. She'd use the rope as a little bit of a reins to help, and she'd push with her foot that board with the angle iron on it through her greenhouse there, and was able to essentially, with that, what you want to do is you wanted that angle iron was basically not slicing through the stems, but it was putting kinks and bends in the stem. And that's what you wanted to be able to do, to be able to kind of crimp the plants so that you would stop their ability to regrow.
Yeah, that's a really cool idea. That's really neat. And we just got a great answer in the chat too about what to leave in the garden. Pamela says, as an urban farmer, I leave the chickweed, purslane, and dandelion in the gardens over the winter. I leave all the kale, parsley, and bush beans. Plus, I don't pull the finished plants. I let the root systems remain intact over the winter, and then leaves are added to insulate all the gardens. So yeah, it's great that people are doing really innovative things all over the place. There are a bunch of questions in the chat. I'm not going to be able to get to all of them because we've just been talking about cropping. We haven't really been talking about livestock yet. You referred to it a bit because you were talking about how Gabe Brown was able to wean himself off of synthetic fertilizers, partly because he had a source of fertilizer in his animals on his farm. So it became very important to his methods there. I guess we could start there. You do say some really cool things about this in the film. It is my favorite part. You talk about the problems with separating the production of crops from the production of livestock. And one reason this part of Kiss the Ground is so important because a lot of people, myself included, we've been really concerned about the climate impact of animal products, especially factory farmed animal products. But I was a vegetarian for 30 years and I did it for the climate. And then in the film, you say the problem isn't the animal. The problem is where the animals are at. And I think a lot of people don't believe this. They think it's not true because the cattle, especially among animals, they're going to emit greenhouse gases no matter where they are. So what is your support for that statement that it's not the animal, it's where the animals are at?
Yeah, I think this is a really good point to be making, especially with people who are very concerned about the planet, because we look at animals and yeah, I'll admit it, I'm a CO2 emitter. I can't stop that. It's biology. It's who we are as creatures. Every creature, every living organism is a CO2 emitter. Um, just kind of to follow up at this, I was at a meeting at the Brookings Institute several years back, and I was sort of there to, at the end of the day, talk about agriculture, and they'd been talking about industry and emissions all day long and how we were going to cut emissions and that was going to solve the problem and everything. And I had gotten a little more than frustrated with some of these individuals just sitting there listening because it wasn't going to be a solution to me. If we're just talking about cutting emissions, that isn't what you're going to do. And so I stood up, and one of the first things I said was, if you're really serious about cutting emissions, stop breathing, because we are CO2 emitters. I mean, we have to live within the reality of how life works on our planet. There's nothing we can do about it. And I'm not advocating. I mean, I said it and then I was like, oh, people are going to say I'm advocating for, certain concepts of genocide. And that's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that this is really about us not looking at emissions, but looking at how we can actually take carbon out of the atmosphere, how we can reduce not just carbon, but methane and nitrous oxide. And again, looking at animals, it isn't just about CO2 emissions, but it is about methane emissions. And there's a lot of concerns about methane emissions. One of the great things that nature has done and what we're learning about is that in these grazing systems, there is an increase of methanotrophic organisms, microorganisms that actually take that methane that's getting emitted by the animals and converting that methane into organic compounds. They utilize that methane as a food source in the same way that other organisms utilize CO2 or sugars created by photosynthetic activity. So you get an increase in those organisms. I mean, again, it's nature's way of being able to increase soil carbon and get that better level of carbon accrual. So can we work on trying to manage systems to enhance the amount of those methanotrophic bacteria that are there that are going to be able to consume some of that methane that are produced by the grazing animal? So we can reduce that. Again, it's not that we're going to eliminate the animals from making these emissions, but we can manage them in such a way so that the impact of those emissions is also managed. We can also manage them in such a way, changing their diets can change the amount of methane that they're going to be emitting. So how can we work with managing their diets? And that a lot goes to, again, some of the forages that grow in these pasture and rangeland ecosystems, because nature did this. Nature didn't, we didn't have what it's about 425 parts per billion. I didn't look today as to what it is, but it's roughly that number. That wasn't what we've had in the atmosphere for most of the time that we've had plants and animals growing. Yes, there were periods of time where it was much greater than that, but that was not when we had plants and animals growing. This is how nature manages those issues. It's how nature creates that balance. So why don't we tap into what we can do with that? The other really great thing about animals and animal integration is a lot of people look too, when I talk about animal integration, one of the things I like to point out is this isn't about just having large ruminant animals on your landscape, because many producers, that gets to be very scary. And especially if you're a grain producer or a produce producer, you don't want it. How do I put animals onto my landscape? It isn't just about having a large ruminant animal. What we can do is we can have, smaller animals. You can have fowl, chickens, other animals like that. But it isn't just about the animals that you might introduce, but it's also about having to manage the landscape to get more of wild animals, not just, native wild animals, deer and here working with moose and elk and those types of animals, but it also is working with birds and bats and insects. And the reason that this is important is that when you have an animal, that animal impact on the plant is a stressor to the plant. So with the animal, I mean, even as you're walking through a field, even as the animal is walking, they're doing a little bit of damage to the leaves. And that is a stressor on the plant. And so any stressor that the plant has, as I was going back to that whole exercise and stressors, is driving the plant to give off exudates below ground so that the plant can get the mineral resources it needs to build the antioxidants that are going to help to build wall resilience and to build the complex biomolecules that help to wall off those leaves that got damaged. And so you need to have, that's again how nature worked and why nature got the plants to be producing these biomolecules, is you needed to have those stressors be a part of the system. And so again, it isn't just about us having, cattle. And I don't have a problem with people who are vegans. I don't care if you choose to eat the animal or not. That isn't the point. But the point is the animal has to be on the landscape. It's not about taking the animal off the landscape. And it has to be on the landscape. And that goes into that position thing as well. We have to have the animal integration onto the landscape and having those putting those stressors on the plants, as opposed to us feeding them grain in a feedlot types of situation.
Yes, very, very important. So this hour has flown by, but I do have one more question for you. There's been a lot of talk in the United States about setting up a carbon bank. The USDA, the Agriculture Secretary, Tom Vilsack, he's saying he could access the Commodity Credit Corporation money, that's like $30 billion a year, and he could use some of that money to start buying carbon credits from farmers, set up a carbon bank, and then if we had a cap and trade program, then fossil fuel polluters could buy offsets from farmers instead of reducing their pollution. So it just occurred to me though that the agriculture sector in the United States might not be in the best position to provide offsets, because right now we're emitting from agriculture 542.1 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. And our sequestration right now is only 10.4. So we've got, just comparing 542 to 10, we're not, our land does sequester carbon, but we're not really at a place where we're ready to start providing offsets to other sectors, in my opinion. Right now, those emissions, you've been talking about this problem of having animals in feedlots and then farmers that are producing feed for them, but those farmers aren't utilizing the animal resources that could help them wean themselves from the synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. And currently, agriculture is about almost 10% of US emissions. And just about half and half of that is coming from the synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and then the emissions from mostly liquefied animal manure at the largest factory farms. So we've got to take care of that problem. I think you've described very well how we could take care of that problem by integrating crops and livestock. But what's your larger opinion on the idea of offsets? Are we ready for the agriculture industry to start providing offsets to other sectors. What's your opinion on the carbon bank? This is a hot topic because the USDA has a comment period open right now until April 29th, I believe. Will you be submitting comments, and what are your opinions on the carbon bank?
Well, I think you're right in the fact that we right now have some fundamental issues that we need to address in agriculture to get us to regenerating the soil and get us to being able to provide those nutrients and pest and disease management that can come from the microbiome. And if it is that we're working with that, again, that's automatically going to help us to do things, like I said, with the methanotrophs, with nitrogen fixers. We don't just have symbiotic nitrogen fixing organisms that are associated with legumes, but we can also work with nitrogen fixers that are the asymbiotic ones, and that can help us to manage nitrogen so we're not applying the nitrogen fertilizers that are being transformed into nitrous oxide. The way that nature works with those systems is that they actually those nitrogen fixers have feedback loops in their nitrogen fixation process that reduces the nitrogen fixation at the point where it may go into contributing to the production of nitrous oxide. So it actually stops those organisms from producing too much nitrogen, because that nitrogen, just like a nitrogen fertilizer, could be transformed into nitrous oxide. So if you don't have a plant growing and utilizing that nitrogen that's being fixed, or you don't have that nitrogen going into other microorganisms or other biology, the nitrogen fixation actually stops. And we find that our levels of nitrogen are so high in many of our crop production areas that we don't even have adequate nitrogen fixation by the legumes that we started to incorporate for nitrogen fertility. Because we over fertilize so much, again, nature controls that from that high amount of nitrous oxide production because it doesn't allow those microbes to do that nitrogen fixation. So we really need to be working on, again, working with the efficiencies of the microbial community for us to be able to do this. What I would like to see Secretary Vilsack do and USDA do is to either take money from the commodity credit, or to take money from crop insurance programs and redirect that to ensuring and enhancing practices that producers put into place for regenerating the soil. That is what's going to make the fundamental difference there, as far as being able to get those things in place. And especially looking at crop insurance. I mean, even with the amount of money that's in the Commodity Credit Corporation, compared to what producers need from crop insurance, and not just what crop insurance gives them directly, but also being able to get operating loans from banks, are the financial infrastructure for most producers is encapsulated within crop insurance and the crop insurance programs. And if we were to change that and shift that away from that type of an operation, or to change how you are insuring. So instead of reducing your instead of reducing the amount of money that you could get for a crop, so you basically get it. I'm not explaining this very well, but you get a penalty if you are incorporating intercropping, or if you incorporate cover crops. They've modified some of this with cover crops because they realize some of the benefits with cover crops, but there still are impacts with that. You're getting, if you don't add an herbicide at the right time when there is a call for that weed management, you can get a penalty for that. If you're not, so essentially the system has made farmers become slaves to this whole idea of locked into this conventional paradigm of high input type of agriculture. That's what we're locked into. So USDA has the opportunity to change that. And the great thing about modifying crop insurance and crop insurance policies is this is also something that USDA can do without having to necessarily go directly through the legislative process, because these are rules that the USDA puts into place for that. using money from the Commodity Credit Corporation, that's also something they don't have to go through the legislative process because it's part of administrative dollars. But that isn't, I don't think that's necessarily the best use of that. So I think there are options there. One of the other things too is I do believe that we do need to get into some sort of carbon offset or carbon credit type of a program. It's not just, from a government standpoint or USD or US government standpoint, but it's a global thing that's happening in how we're going to be, again, moving offsets and moving these things around within corporations and being able to get more corporations to support some of these regenerative agricultural practices is them being able to purchase offsets. So I do believe that that is an important part of it. But one of the things that has happened, and one of the things that I'm involved in up here in Canada, is looking at how we're going to assess, measure, and monitor carbon accrual in the soil to be able to sell true carbon offsets. And what has happened is doing the measuring and monitoring for the most part is seen as being prohibitively expensive to be able to do that. The amount of sampling that it takes, the amount of analytics that it takes to take a look at this is just not something that people or corporations, individual producers can afford to be able to do. And so what ends up happening is there are carbon models that are out there that are modeling carbon accrual, and they're based on practices. But the practices themselves, just no-till by itself, just reducing inputs by itself, just adding cover crops by itself, those practices, unless they're a part of that system and are focused on regenerating the soil, are not enough to really accrue carbon. So we basically have said, and it keeps us in that almost that paradigm where we're locked into these recipes. We talk about the fact that in conventional agriculture, the problem is we created an input recipe system that has had negative impacts. We're doing the same thing with the regenerative system because we're saying you have to do no-till, you have to do this, and it becomes a checklist where it isn't then about what really is happening and regenerating the soil as being that component that is necessary for that to occur. So in order to be able to assess how we're regenerating soil, measuring and monitoring is an important component of that, but measuring and monitoring becomes almost prohibitively expensive to do. What the project I'm working on up here in Canada is trying to do is we're utilizing technology, some hyperspectral imaging technology, to not just work with the models and work with the spectral imagery that we get after we put practices into place, but we're actually utilizing that to determine a sampling design, which reduce our costs of sampling. Where the project that I've worked with up here in Alberta, we're going into our second full year of sampling with this, but we've been working on it for about 4 years, is we essentially utilized this imagery to create a sampling design where we're taking about 500 samples throughout the province of Alberta, and we're then going to map the entire province of Alberta. And we can get the level of imagery that we can get with this is in about a 30-meter level of resolution. So we're looking at this in such a way that you could really be able to now know how much carbon you are accruing and what then you could sell as true offsets, instead of, I think that I'm accruing this much based on the fact that I'm using no-till, but nobody's really going out there and measuring it. And then if I sell those offsets and I didn't actually accrue that much carbon, who's going to pay the penalty? Is that going to be me as a producer that's going to pay that penalty? Because I got paid for selling an offset that I didn't even do, but I didn't know that I didn't do it because I got told. So it's a sticky business that we could get into, but I think we've got a lot of options and opportunities here, again, to be able to get this to work.
Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. Well, Kris, I have learned so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Kris Nichols, for sharing the perspectives and knowledge of a soil scientist. We need more people like you. I hope that there are people who were listening today thinking about how to use their biology degrees and decide to go into soil science. I'm just so inspired by everything we've learned from you. And thank you to everybody who chimed in with comments. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but I do encourage you all to seek out videos of Kris Nichols' talks online. She was recently at Eco Farm and gave a keynote there that's very good. There's a video from North Dakota from 2019 as well, where another great talk. So there's just so much knowledge, Kris, that you have that is out there online that we can access. But this has been a great talk, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to all of the people who have attended.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.